So good morning. This is the day the Lord has made. There you go. That's just right. Perfect way to start the day. Now, I am the MC today, and I have to. I'm going over in my mind the steps I have to take here to figure this all out. I have to say, you're in for a real treat. Just from the reading that I've done, and I haven't read anywhere close to everything that Professor Alter has written, but I have to say I read his book, The Art of Bible Translation, which is just so full of spurs and insights and inspirations in so many directions that if you're reading it as a thoughtful Christian who's interested in the scriptures, you will get a great benefit from it. It's so full of practical wisdom about the nature of Bible translation and the versions of the Bible which we use. And so get a copy and you won't regret it if you read it. It's always the case, you know. But let's just say Professor Alter won't regret it as long as you buy the copy, at least. So it's also that. It's a recent experience of mine. I was not acquainted with Professor Alter's work. So since these are the Chadwick-Oden lectures, and Thomas Oden's son, Ed, and nephew are here. Can you, and Tal and Ed, just to recognize you, since we're indebted so much to your marvelous forebear and his friends. So glad you're here. And it's always nice to see continuity, you know. Patristic, scripture, people, it's always nice to see things move along in a kind of tradition that's directed by God's providence. So recognizing this as the Chadwick-Oden lecture, I thought, well, what do we have that might connect the Chadwick collection with Professor Alter's work? And I came across this lovely volume which has Henry Chadwick's signature in the front of Monsignor Ronald Knox's little treatise. It's actually 8 treatises on Englishing the Bible. Now, it was also published under a different title, Trials of a Translator. That was another one. Maybe they thought that would be more kicky and they could sell more copies, but in any case, that was a later version. Now, Monsignor Knox, if you are not aware, he is, along with Professor Alter and St. Jerome, one of the few people who has ever essayed to translate the entire Bible by himself, all right? He points out kind of snottily that, well, usually Bibles are translated by a syndicate, and therefore they choose according to committee what the translations are going to be. Now, of course, we learned from Professor Alter that that magnificent product of a committee, namely the authorized or King James Version, is a good example of something that came from a committee that actually worked. That doesn't always happen. But it was Lancelot, Andrews, and these people, that person of such a quality that you couldn't get anything but something wonderful. And of course, as Catholics, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage because if we're Catholics of a particularly traditional bent, we'll refer to the existence of the Douay-Rheims version. And of course, that's a translation from the Vulgate. It's from the Latin, not from the original languages. And but Bishop Challoner, who did the revision, grew up an Anglican and had the King James obviously firmly in his head. So when he revised the Douay, it's very clearly under that influence. Because if you speak English, whether you've ever picked up the King James Bible or not, you are under the influence of that magnificent monument of civilization that has a tremendous impact everywhere, even to this day. But if you're a Protestant, luckily you can always refer back to that authoritatively, even if you're using every conceivable crazy translation for this youth group or that crowd or whatever. You can always refer back to it and feel safe and secure because it is authorized, as it's called in England, and for use in churches, you know. So now we have our authorized version, which was originally the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome, which was authoritatively supported by the Council of Trent in the face of original language translation projects, like the King James, and also to assert its authority as a monument of Christian tradition and as legitimate for disputation and discussion and so on. And of course, Jerome's Vulgate is nothing to be sniffed at, of course, and we all know that. But the problem that I notice and that is bringing me to Alter's wonderful insights is that, just let me get a handkerchief here. Nothing to sniff at, and that's exactly okay, just a minute here. Deep pockets on these habits, yeah, they're just enormously low. Oh, it was, I put it here. They always told me in Italy, utilizza la pancia. So I did, I stuck it right there. Anyway, so it's not going to fall to the ground, believe me. Back to my point, the quality of living in a tradition that depended largely simply upon translations, which were not interested in the quality of using editions which are translated by people who are interested in sort of lexical, correct, nuanced translation of the words, but without much attention to the form and the aesthetic quality. This is a serious challenge. And the beautiful teaching of Professor Alter, which I think the Fathers of the Church would all agree with, and we can all agree with, and it's our context, various contexts, we know it's true, that the aesthetic quality of the original text of the Scriptures, the Hebrew, has to be part of the message. That is, the language God chose to give it in, and the beautiful way in which it was expressed. Now, the Old Testament is high literature, or some of it more moderate, accessible literature, but it's high literature in a way that the New Testament is not. Because the New Testament, written in Greek, and its Vulgate version, is written in a language which already had its rhetorical and literary standard well established by the time those works were produced. And so, although it's beautiful, of course, because for us it's the Word of God, and they're passages of transcendent beauty, still it's not a literary work in the way in which the Hebrew Bible is. And that's something which we sense, so that our sense of literary beauty in terms of confronting the Scriptures comes predominantly from the Old Testament. No one can deny this with the Psalter and the Song of Songs, but many other passages as well. We know this to be true. You can't even, if you translate the Song of Songs into English, even if you do a bad job, it's still going to be beautiful. That's how beautiful the original is, and the Psalms as well. So this focus, which I found in his discussion of translation, is really welcome, because it corresponds also to the deepest and earliest insights of the Fathers of the Church, who, of course, in taking up the Scriptures, they, without any critical sense at all, thank God, they just simply use the tools of classical Greco-Roman rhetoric to expound the text. And of course, the rhetorical end par excellence is delight. That's, you're profitable to your hearer and you delight your hearer. And if you've done that, you'll get your message through and you'll move the hearts and all of that. So the delight of the beauty of the rhetorical exposition of Scripture in Christianity, in a sense, compensates for the relative lack of aesthetic beauty of the actual translations in comparison to the original. I think that's why in the Hebrew tradition there's much more focus simply on explaining the text simply, and not until more recently in history a sense of like a big rhetorical sermonic approach to the readings from Scripture. And I think that's a crucial difference, but it shows how we compensated in a way that gave the text a beautiful context that it would not have necessarily had if it had been read baldly. And I think that we have benefited very much from that, because it brought in the themes of classical rhetoric in such a way that we can use it effectively and authoritatively without abusing the original text of Scripture, and that's very important as well. But plays on words, word plays, syntax, rhythm, all of these things, they're part of the message. They're part of the message. And so when we have a translation, the attempt to repeat those techniques, even if not exactly as the Hebrew, it actually does more justice to the original text, if you just make an effort. Now, our friend Monsignor Ronald Knox, who translated the Vulgate into English, and whose volume we have in the Chadwick Library with Henry Chadwick's signature in it, he makes a very strong point of this, that in order to appreciate the aesthetic quality of the scriptures, you have to accommodate it to English without abusing the sense. And he did that in many places in his translation. For example, the acrostic psalms and whatnot, he has them all beginning with letters of the alphabet and so on. Many other examples of that. But that didn't follow through in the 60s and the post-conciliar period with the new liturgy, because there was no interest in producing a liturgical version which was beautiful. I mean, that's really true. The interest was to have a brainy, annotated edition used in the liturgy. And there were attempts, some weak attempts on the part of some in the Holy See to remind people, no, the Church's liturgical tradition is comprehensive, and so we have to pay attention to the Vulgate and the Septuagint and these things, and not just have these productions. So that's why, for me at least, and maybe I'm getting down a rabbit hole of domestic issues among Catholics, but it also affects Protestants as well, that really and truly the insight which he shares with us is most important, that the aesthetic quality of translations is a way of representing the message, that without which we won't appreciate what we're being given. And for example, if you're reading Virgil's Aeneid, if you're reading Virgil's Aeneid, you don't need to have a sermon to explain it. You don't need a long discourse. You just need to explain the text, because it's already so evidently beautiful. But if you were to have a prose translation of Virgil's Aeneid and then try to get someone to realize how important this is, you'd have to do a whole lot of talking. All right, and that means that it's not an ideal translation. A translation which provides the beauty, like Dryden's or someone, gives us also the insight into the original sense of Virgil, even though it may be far in linguistically. So that's my little pseudo lecture. But I have to say that I just want to quote Thomas Millet, who's a theologian at Baylor University, speaking of Robert Alter's work, has said, "A proper appreciation should lead Christians to value highly the Old Testament as their principal source of literary delight. There are many reasons to reject Marcion, but the hedonist angle has been too little explored." That is, the Old Testament's delightful, so we shouldn't reject it. With this in mind, we should affirm that Alter has done the Christian community an ineffable service. He has returned to us a text that can be enjoyed and savored. I've checked various things and I can verify that. He has shown the scriptures to be an object of delight, capable of returning sustained enjoyment over the years as a repayment for all the close attention we give to those texts. And since we are formed by such pleasures into being better Christians, it can and should be said that the achievements of Robert Alter are positively evangelical in nature. Fitted through the sieve of Alter's pen, the scriptures can allure us to themselves once more, and we are in his debt. So welcome to Professor Alter, with many thanks to Roberta and Howard for making this possible. We really are very, very grateful, and we look forward with delight to his words.
Let's see, is this working? Yeah, I think. Thank you very much, Father, for your very generous remarks. And I have to say that I have never thought of myself as an evangelical. So you learn new things all the time. Okay, what I'd like to do to preface both these lectures is to spend a little time explaining to you how biblical poetry works. Because people generally don't understand this, and I have to say that it is not very precisely understood among biblical scholars. In part because, maybe to a large extent, because biblical scholars don't know much about poetry. It's just an empirical fact. So it's been known since the 18th century, since Bishop Loth's lectures, that a line of biblical poetry is based on semantic parallelism. That is, two halves of the line that seem to mirror each other in meaning. But the fact of the matter is that it's more complicated and much more interesting than that. That there is, as I'll try to explain, a dynamic relationship between the two halves of the line. So things are happening all the time in lines of biblical poetry that we miss because we don't see this. So to begin with, semantic parallelism is only one of three components of parallelism. And this was beautifully explained years ago by the Yale comparative literature scholar, Benjamin Harshav, who was a brilliant expositor of formal systems of poetry in many languages. He knew many languages, and among those was Hebrew. So he proposed that the three elements are semantic, which was recognized in the 18th century, rhythmic or accentual, and syntactic. And you have lines of poetry, and I'll illustrate that in a moment, where all three components are there, sometimes two, only one, and a certain freedom is exercised by the poets, just as Shakespeare wrote blank verse, iambic pentameters, but sometimes he abandoned iambic pentameter for one reason or another. This is lost on biblical scholars, and they have proposed various kinds of complicated and unworkable systems, such as counting syllables, which then requires reconstructing what the original vowel system of ancient Hebrew was, which is a speculative prospect. So what I'd like to show is, for the next few minutes, is the way biblical poetry moves beyond mere synonymity. Now, let me begin by saying this, that I think all systems of poetry that I'm familiar with are mnemonic devices. Poetry is a mnemonic device. It's meant to be remembered. We're familiar with rhyme and a sequence of accented and unaccented symbols. For example, Shakespeare's 73rd sonnet, "That time of year thou mayst," I'll just do the first quatrain, don't worry. That time of year that mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs that shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet bird sang. So you see, you have behold at the beginning, and that helps you remember cold. You have hang, and that helps you remember sang. And there's one variation from the iambic pentameter, bare ruin choirs, and those monosyllables with the accent at the beginning of the line stress the bare and stress the ruin. That's one of many reasons why Shakespeare is an astounding poet. Okay, now I will take what is the second poem that appears in Genesis. As Genesis has a lot of brief poetic insets. Some of them, many of them are just one line, and then a long poem at the end. And this is from chapter 4, and we don't know anything about this speaker, Lamech, except what he says in these lines. So the first line is as follows: Ada and Silla, O hearken my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. So this is perfect parallelism, all three components. You have the names of the two wives, and then you wives of Lamech. You have hearken, and you have give ear, you have voice, speech. So that neatly illustrates the system that has been claimed of synonymity. But if you look down in the poem, you find the following line, or listen to the following line. For sevenfold Cain is avenged, and Lamech 70 and 7. So what happened to the synonymity? The fact of the matter is, whenever you have numbers in a line of biblical poetry, they have to go up from the first half to the second, either by a decimal place or a decimal place plus the number itself. So, for example, in the so-called Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, how can one pursue 100 and 10 give 10,000 the chase? So you go 1 to 2, 10 to 10,000. Now, that tells you how the system works. That is, as you move from the first half of the line to the second half of the line, things are stepped up. They get stronger, they get more intense, sometimes there's narrative development. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples and then move right into Job. Also in Deuteronomy 32, he referring to God, and the him refers to Israel. He suckled him honey from the crag and oil from the flinty stone. Now, the first half of the line is kind of understandable naturalistically, that if you could find beehives in the crags of rocks. But the second half of the line, you have something totally miraculous. You have oil from stone. And not, if the first half is just crag, Selah, the second half of the line is an especially hard kind of stone, Chalmish Tzur, the flintstone. And that's typical of what happens. Okay, now I will give you, with your permission, a more sensual example. In the Song of Songs, in the last chapter, you have the young woman is speaking, and she says, "Would that you were a brother to me, suckling my mother's breasts." Now, brother is in the first half of the line. So the poet needs a synonym or some kind of equivalent for brother. You can't say male sibling in biblical Hebrew, and that would be an abomination in a line of poetry in any case. So instead, he says, suckling my mother's breasts. That's what a brother would do. maybe a twin brother or a brother close in birth to the woman's birth. But it's different. It doesn't mean the same thing. That is, brother is the general relational term, whereas sucking the breast is a very sensual image, and it's a kind of intimation under the guise of introducing an ad hoc synonym. It's a kind of intimation of the sensual union that she imagines between her and the young man that she loves. So you see that development takes place. It's not just saying the same thing twice. Okay, I won't trouble you any further with this introduction to biblical poetry, but you'll see some of it right away in the Job text. Now, to begin with, I'm going to ask the question which I'll ask this afternoon about Isaiah as a prophet. That is, why did Job compose his text in poetry? Well, you can say two things. One is that poetry is a much more effective vehicle for conveying the full anguish that Job experiences in his suffering, but then also to convey the full breathtaking scope of God's vision of creation at the end. You couldn't do it nearly as effectively in prose. But I also have to add this, that the anonymous figure who composed the poetry of Job was one of the greatest poets in the entire ancient world. He's definitely up there with Homer and Virgil and the great tragedians and so forth. So he knew that he was a fine poet and that poetry was his medium, and he exercised it with great relish. I'll say just one thing which is not terribly visible in translation, although we will see something of it in chapter 3. He has the biggest vocabulary of any ancient Hebrew poet. In fact, there happen to be 5 Hebrew words for lion, L-I-O-N, which is the translator's despair. I think we all, so, you say the lion, the main beast, the king of beasts. It doesn't work quite the same. These are one-word designations, and presumably in ancient Israel there are a lot of lions roaming around, and they probably distinguish between different kinds, which we don't have anymore. So the Job poet uses all the words in the Hebrew lexicon, and he invents words, he borrows words from Aramaic, but he's amazing in more than this respect. So, the poetic part of Job, which is the bulk of the book, begins in chapter 3 with a death wish poem. We'll see what happens to that death wish when God speaks at the end of the book. But I think it's one of the most powerful expressions of despair, one of the most powerful death wish poems in the whole Western tradition. And Job spoke up and he said, "Annul the day that I was born and the night that said, a man is conceived." Okay, I want to stop dead there for a minute. I will progress more rapidly in a minute. Okay, day and night are a common pair in biblical poetry. You know, day in the first half, night in the second. As in Psalms, day after day um, he utters speech. Night after night he speaks knowledge. Okay, so he's a very neat parallelism there. But what does the Job poet do? He starts by cursing the day he was born, but that isn't enough for him. He wants not only to have been born, but never to have been conceived. So he goes back 9 months to the night on which he was conceived. Now, the conception and birth of a male child in this patriarchal society, what one must say, was an occasion for great joy. And he says it was actually a disaster. So you can see how creative he is in the use of the parallelism, and it is an intensification, like the number intensifications. Okay, that day let it be darkness. Let God above not seek it out, nor brightness shine upon it. Let darkness, death's shadow, foul it. Let a cloud mass rest upon it. Let day gloom dismay it. That night let murk overtake it. Let it not join in the days of the year. Let it not enter the number of months. Well, you can see that in 4 or 5 lines, you have maybe half a dozen different terms for darkness, as he keeps building the effect. And in fact, the word that I've translated day gloom, we're not entirely sure what it means, and he may have invented it. It seems to reflect an Aramaic root that does mean darkness, and day gloom might be an eclipse, but we're not sure. That night, oh, let that night be, verse 7, let that night be barren, let it have no song of joy. You see, the prospect that a male child may have been conceived should be an occasion for joy. Let the day cursers hex it, those ready to rouse Leviathan. Okay, I have to comment on a notorious error in the Authorized Version. The Authorized Version says something like those instead where I have those ready to rouse Leviathan, they have those ready to rouse their mourning with a U. Now, this is totally wrong. Why is it wrong? The Hebrew is Leviathan, which means Leviathan. But Leviathan, the homonym, means their mourning, not in biblical Hebrew, but in Rabbinic Hebrew, or their funeral, it actually means. And they also got the grammar wrong because the ans, if it meant their funeral or their mourning, it would have to be feminine plural, and there's no feminine around here. So that's an unfortunate error, because what he's done as he moves on in the poem is to raise the stakes. He now raises the stakes to mythology, which he uses all the time in his poetry. I mean, mythology is whether you're a monotheist or not, is a powerful vehicle for poetic expression, as Milton knew when he composed Paradise Lost. So, so he's now calling on mythological creatures who are going to curse the primordial sea monster Leviathan to join in cursing that day and that night. Let its twilight stars go dark, let it hope for day in vain, and let it not see the eyelids of dawn. Now that line and that image, I think, shows what a great poet the Job poet was. It is a crime to transpose it, as modern translators do, into something like glimmering of dawn. The eyelids of dawn, it's when you look on the eastern horizon at 5 o'clock in the morning and you see the first crack of light. It's like the sleeper's eyes opening. And at the end of Job, he will use that image again in a drastically different context. There, it's part of the description, the fearsome description of Leviathan. Okay, let me continue. For it did not shut the belly's door to hide wretchedness from my eyes. So, life is wretchedness. You can see what a sweeping expression of despair this is. It's the Hebrew word amal, which recurs in his poetry associated with existence itself. Why did I not die from the womb, from the belly come out, breathed my last? Okay, so if he can't blot out the night he was conceived, at least he could have been born, he could have been a stillborn. Why did knees welcome me, and why breasts that I should suck? And I think that the knees are the mother's knees when he's coming out of the birth channel, or when the infant is. For now I would lie and be still, would sleep and know repose. With kings, so death is the one solution to all this unbearable misery. For now I would lie and be still, would sleep and know repose, with kings and the counselors of earth who build ruins for themselves. That is another remarkable moment, that is, they build great palaces and they crumble to ruins. It's like Shelley's poem Ozymandias, where he finds this crumbling but boastful monument to an ancient king. Or like a buried stillborn I'd be, like babes who never saw light. There the wicked cease their troubling, and there the weary repose. Altogether the prisoners are tranquil, they hear not the taskmaster's voice. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free of his master. Why give light to the wretched and life to the deeply embittered, who wait for death in vain, dig for it more than a treasure, who rejoice in the tomb, are glad when they find a grave. Now, this is a panoramic vision of human life, and it's all misery. In other words, he goes beyond his own suffering, and he says, what is life? You know, you have oppressors, you have slaves, you have taskmasters, you have people all the time in anguishing circumstances, and death is the only way out. to a man whose way is hidden, and God has hedged him about. Now, I translated the Hebrew verb there, the second line, literally, hedged him about. And it shows, I would say, almost the literary cunning of the Job poet. Because in the gathering of the sons of God, these are not literal sons of God as in Christian theology, but the Hebrew ben has the general function of belonging to the category. They're kind of part of the divine entourage. And in the gathering of the divine entourage, the mean-spirited member of the sons of God, the adversary, says, not Satan, he's not the mythological Satan, says, well, you've hedged Job about. Well, of course he's a good man because you give him all this protection. So now that same verb occurs here in a sense that God has entrapped man. God has hedged him about. So it's a totally different sense. And then it will recur in the voice from the world, will instill a third sense, which we will look at in a couple of minutes. For before my bread, my moaning comes, and my roar pours out like water. For I feared a thing, it befell me. What I dreaded came upon me. I was not quiet, I was not still. I had no repose, and trouble came. Okay, I think I hardly need to comment on those final words. So there are three levels of poetry in the book of Job. There's Job's poetry as a vehicle to express anguish. And you can see that very powerfully articulated in his first poem, and again throughout the body of the poem. And there are the things going on in the poem, alas, that you just can't translate, because this is such a resourceful poet. For example, Job says, my days are as swift as the weaver's shuttle. They snap off without hope. But the word hope, tikva, has a homonym that means thread. So simultaneously it's hopelessness and a broken thread. I mean, only a remarkable poet could do something like that. Okay, so there's Job's very powerful poetry. Then there's the poetry of the three so-called comforters, the three friends. And there is some strong poetry that they speak, because this poet was not capable of producing very weak poetry. But on the whole, it's not as striking, not as original as Job's poetry. And that goes along with the conventional theology that they are expressing, which is received ideas and then received poetic stereotypes. Then the Job poet, and this is, I hope, a demonstration of why the poetic medium is so important in understanding the meaning. He then does something very daring. God has been silent throughout the poetic body of the book, and then he speaks from the whirlwind. Now, what he decides, what the poet then decides to do is to shape for God an order of poetry with a very different message that is even greater than Job's poetry, as great as it is. And it has to be greater because it comes from God. I will mention a perhaps irreverent parallel. In a novel that I love and have read repeatedly over the years, James Joyce's Ulysses, Molly Bloom is much spoken of in the course of the book. And then, and she's, of course, on the mind of her husband, Leopold Bloom, throughout the book, but she's not directly present. And then in the final episode of Ulysses, we have Bloom is now asleep, and Molly beside him is ruminating in the dark. And we have a kind of soliloquy that is the last part of the book. And some of it by the judgment of publishers in 1922 was obscene, and they were unwilling to publish Ulysses. But it's actually not obscene. It's just frankly sensual. And it is an order of poetry which is greater than all the great poetry that has preceded, as the culmination of the book and the speech of the goddess-like woman, in a way, who has been the center of attention. So I hope you will forgive that comparison. We now turn to the God speech in chapter 38. And the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, and he said, "Who is this who darkens counsel in words without knowledge?" Okay, I want to stop for a moment on darkens counsel. It's an idiom that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible. Obviously, the sense of it is speaking inadvisedly, speaking without knowledge, as he says. Well, the original idiom crafted here is beautifully chosen, because what does it take us back to? It takes us back to chapter 3, to this kind of symphony of darkness that Job, in the Death Wish poem, evoked in his poetry. We'll see more about darkness and light in just a moment. Gird your loins like a man, that I may ask you, and you can inform me. Where were you when I founded earth? Tell me if you know understanding. Okay, I want to say something about an objection that's often been made to the God speech. Some commentators have said, well, God is a kind of cosmic bully. You know, he said, hey, I have a bigger perspective than you have, so just keep your mouth shut. But I think that's a vulgarization. What the speech from the whirlwind will propose is that there is a dazzling and complicated vision of creation which is beyond human ken, and which Job cannot understand. Who fixed its measures? Do you know? Or who stretched a line upon it? In what were its sockets sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The sons of God play a very different role here. And by the way, this version of creation is quite different from Genesis 1. That is, you have the morning stars singing together, which is a beautiful image of cosmic harmony. Who hedged the sea with double doors when it gushed forth from the womb? Okay, let's stop short on hedge the sea. That's that same verb, hedged, that has occurred twice before. Now, what he's doing is taking a commonplace that goes back to Canaanite poetry and making something quite original out of it. The commonplace is this. Creation takes place when the sea, in the Canaanite version, the monstrous sea god, is subdued by, in the Canaanite version, Baal, a land god, a weather god, and held back, which is a creation myth that makes sense of the fact that ancient Israel is a narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean shore, and the waves are constantly beating on the shore and in a storm threatening it. So the sea has to be held back for the world to come into being. As I said, in the Canaanite version, that's strictly mythological, and the Job poet naturalizes this to monotheism and makes it something not quite mythological. And he takes that verb to hedge, which first was used by the adversary for God giving Job special protection, then used by Job himself for being entrapped, and here is used cosmically to show the blocking off of the sea from the land. When I made cloud its clothing, who hedged the sea with double doors when it gushed forth from the womb, when I made cloud its clothing and thick mist its swaddling bands. I find these lines quite amazing. First of all, they're an answer to Job. They're an answer to the death wish. That is, the death wish was all about blotting out birth, canceling conception, being stillborn. Whereas here, creation itself is a birth. And that's an original image for the Job poet. That is, the sea is the womb of creation. And then, what about these swaddling bands? Now, probably most of you know that they didn't have diapers in the ancient world. So the baby was wrapped in these strips of white linen to make it secure and comfortable. And so what are they doing here? Well, he's visualizing the mist on the sea. There's strips of white over the water, like swaddling bands. But of course, the fact that he uses this metaphor takes us back to birth again. Birth instead of death. That is, this God is a God of life. Have you ever commanded the morning, appointed the dawn to its place? To seize the earth's corners that the wicked be shaken from it? It turns like sealing clay, takes color like a garment, and their light is withdrawn from the wicked, and the upraised arm is broken. Have you come into the springs of the sea, in the bottommost deep walked about? Have the gates of death been laid bare to you, and the gates of death's shadows have you seen? So here death is not something wished for, but part of the big picture that is controlled by God. Did you take in the breath of the earth? Tell if you know it all. Here is the way that light dwells, and darkness. Where is the light? I'm sorry. Where is the way that light dwells, and darkness? Where is its place? Let's see. I think I need to move this. Oh, I haven't been moving this forward at all. My apologies for those who. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, there's light and darkness in chapter 3, but it's always Job's hope that the darkness would swallow the light. And here you have a kind of diurnal rhythm of light and darkness, which is part of the harmony of creation as God has made it. I think I will skip down a little bit here to verse 24. By what way does the west wind fan out and the east wind whip over the earth? Who split a channel for the torrent and a way for the thunderstorm? For rain on a land without man, wilderness bare of humankind, to sate the desolate dunes. There I tried to imitate the alliteration of the Hebrew, and make the grass sprout there. Does the rain have a father? Or who begot the drops of dew? From whose belly did the ice come forth? To the frost of the heavens, who gave birth? So you can see we two things happening here. First, the world is a playing field of strong, even violent energies. It's a splitting a channel for the torrent, the east wind whipping over the earth. But then we also go back to begetting and birth. Does the rain have a father, or who begot the drops of dew? And then verse 29 is another one of those breathtakingly daring lines of poetry in Job. That is, the origins of ice, he represents as a birth. And so then you get this shocking image of ice coming out of the womb. And so birth is everywhere, even where you wouldn't expect it. Now, I want to go on just briefly. I promise to conclude presently with chapter 39. Do you know the mountain goat's birth time? Do you mark the calf? There's one more thing I want to say. That the God perspective, unlike Job's perspective, challenges anthropomorphism. Anthropocentrism, I should say. That is, the version of creation we get in Genesis is very anthropocentric. And we should keep in mind that the Hebrew Bible evolved over, really, if you go to the earliest text to the latest, 9 centuries. And there are different understandings of God and creation and different viewpoints in it. So the Job poet is proposing, and this is something that's hard for a mere human mind, our own minds as well, to grasp, that there is life and sustenance that has nothing to do with humankind. That the rain comes down on desolate dunes and places where there is no humanity. And that's spelled out in some of the other lines. So then we go back to more birth, but it's birth in the animal kingdom. Do you number the months till they come to term and know their birthing time? They crouch, burst forth with their babes. Their young they push out to the world. And the burst forth, the Hebrew means something like split open. It's a very unusual word for birth. But even birth is a kind of violence, which is something God wants Job to understand. Their offspring batten, go big in the wild. They go out and do not return. Who set the wild ass free and the onager's reins who loosed, whose home I made in the steppes, his dwelling place, flats of salt. He scoffs at the bustling city. The driver shouts, he does not hear. He roams mountains for his forage, and every green thing he seeks. Will the wild ox want to serve you? Pass the night at your feeding trough? Bind the wild ox with cord for the furrow. Will he harrow the valleys behind you? Can you rely on him with his great power and leave your labor to him? Can you trust him to bring back your seed, gather grain on your threshing floor? Okay, I'm going to skip down because I do want to draw this to a close. Well, you have animals, and this is really a precursor to Behemoth and Leviathan, to animals, quasi-mythological animals that are so powerful that they can never be subdued or tamed by human beings. And here you have this in a more naturalistic term. So in a way, the structure of the whole poem that God speaks mirrors the structure of the line in moving toward intensification. So you move toward from untamable animals to beasts that seem almost mythological. Okay, I can't resist letting you hear the evocation of the war horse, verse 18. Verse 19. Do you give might to the horse? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make his roar like locusts? His splendid snort is terror. He churns up the valley exulting. In power goes out to the clash of arms. He scoffs at fear and is undaunted, turns not back before the sword. Over him rattles the quiver, the blade, the javelin, the spear. With clamor and clatter he swallows the ground and ignores the trumpet sound. At the trumpet he says, "Aha!" And from afar he scents the fray, the thunder of captains, the shouts. Well, I think the Job poet couldn't resist doing this because he knew he could do it so well. This unfathomable power of the stallion in battle. Now, there's a concluding image here, which I'll take just 2 minutes to look at. Does the hawk soar by your wisdom? spread his wings to fly away south. By your word does the eagle mount and set his nest on high. On the crag he dwells and beds down, on the crest of the crag his stronghold. From there he seeks out food, from afar his eyes look down. His chicks lap up blood, where the slain are, there he is. Now, what seems to me remarkable about this, and it's keyed into the whole vision of creation that God presents, is that it's a totally vivid but unsentimental vision of nature. That is, nature is red of tooth and claw, and the eagle, in order to sustain his young, has to kill, and the chicks lap up blood. So that, in a way, directs itself toward Job's complaint. That is, there is some kind of mystery in nature. There's violence in nature. There's killing in nature, but it's all part of the natural cycle. Now, I hope I have shown that as all this unfolds, from Job's despair at the beginning to the grand divine vision at the end, that poetry is the necessary vehicle, and in order to fully appreciate what we call the message, I'm not totally comfortable with that term, what we call the message, you have to see the dynamism of what's going on in every line of poetry. Thank you. Yeah.
So now we have the question and answer.
Yeah, we'll probably need the mic in the audience.
There are 2 mics back there that will be passed out by helpful seminarians. So there you are. Yeah. So for the persons who want to ask questions. So, and Professor Alter will recognize the persons. Thanks. So we have 30 minutes.
Yeah. Yes. This gentleman over here. It's not on.
Hello. This works.
Okay, we have a backup here.
This one's on.
Perfect,
Yes,
perfect.
we've got it. I'm curious about what dating you would assign to the book of Job, because you've alluded to him borrowing some from Aramaic, and there are some scholars that place the start of Aramaic in the use of Aramaic in Hebrew poetry to the exile, but there are other folks who say that Job is the earliest book of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious as to how you would deal with the whole history of Job
Okay.
and the origin.
I think it's totally unsustainable to date Job early. The presence of Aramaic in his poetry is one strong indication of that. And there's also another kind of lexical illustration. For example, the way you say words in Job is milim, which afterwards became the standard Hebrew word for words, and it's the modern Hebrew word for words. In the pre-exilic period, milim doesn't exist. You have dvarim. The Ten Commandments are actually called Aseret HaDibrot or Aseret HaDvarim. So there's no possibility that it's late. I would say it's probably a composition of the 5th century BCE, the 400s. Now, I will add to that something about this period. In the first Israelite Commonwealth, say from about the year 1000 or a little bit after that, until its destruction in 586, there was a relative uniformity. I mean, there were differences. Deuteronomy is quite different stylistically from the earlier Hebrew texts, but the same literary conventions recur, and I wouldn't say there's an absolute ideological unanimity, because Deuteronomy introduces some new ideas, particularly the notion of the centrality of the cult in Jerusalem, which was not a general idea in the early centuries before Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is from the late 7th century BCE. But as I say, there is a relative linguistic, stylistic, literary uniformity in these texts from the first big period. Then in what scholars call the late biblical period, which begins in the Babylonian exile, you have a kind of explosion of new literary forms. Like there is nothing like the Book of Esther, and nothing like Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, nothing like Job in the earlier texts, and this is not only an explosion of literary form, but also certainly for Job, Ecclesiastes, it's an explosion of thinking about the world. As we've seen, the anthropocentrism of the earlier period, which all currents reflect, is challenged radically by Job. By the way, that's one of the reasons why Job, not just Leviathan, that Job appealed to Herman Melville when he wrote Moby Dick. Because Moby Dick is a radically anti-anthropocentric book. So that's the story. This has to be from the later period. Yes. Oh.
Good morning, everyone. As a consultant accountant by profession, I'm way below this realm of intelligence, intellects. Between a poet and a prophet, I think as a woman and mother, I lean more towards a prophet, only because it has a very structure, boundaries in society that we need, especially looking at what's happening in the world. As a poet and poetry with all this, there's a beautiful rhythmic, how should I say, intensification that encompasses it.
Mm-hmm.
So my question, bottom line is, given the backdrop of society now, because I prefer numbers over words, so to speak, no offense to anyone, as a society overall, looking at all this, how would poetry assist to bring some kind of peace in this journey that we're all going through? Because if I look at Job, and I'm pretty familiar with scriptures based on my upbringing on the island, if I'm looking at Job, I'm seeing a human person crying out, being lost in the wilderness. I'm shaking, I'm sorry. A person crying out in the wilderness, just seeking guidance and being subjective in his voice. He's looking for this objective truth. He's seeking it out, and he wants guidance. It was only when God responded, and in God's authoritative voice, which is what we need in society, so to speak, it's like, I'm the authority. I am who am. Those, even the whole thing of creation is like, it's so evident that there is an authority figure. There is God who exists, who has created all this for mankind. So the bottom line for me is poetry is beautiful. There's a rhythmic intensification in it. But as a woman, as a mother, a daughter, so to speak, and descend from the tribe of Joseph, I prefer to have truth, objective truth, in this whole maze that we're all traveling as human beings. So I don't know if it's a question or if it's just a statement, but it's just, poetry does serve a purpose, and there's beauty in it. So thank you so much.
Okay, I really appreciate your remarks. I would say a couple things, focusing, I'll be talking more about the prophets and poetry this afternoon. Focusing on Job, I think that believing people, and then people who are searching and they're not sure that they believe anything, we should not exclude them. We all need comfort. There are many hardships in life, and life is full of loss. My beloved wife of 49 years died 3 years ago, and I still can't quite get over it. So we need comfort, but we also need challenges. We need to know that things may not always be harmonious, that there are contradictions and challenges to our need for comfort. And since you eloquently speak about your feeling about things as a mother, and I have 4 kids, and of course all long grown. I think the affirmation of birth and nurturing is so central in God's response to Job that is something that everyone can take on board, and especially mothers. We have Howard.
In Samuel, there's a story about King Saul. Now, here's a popular verse being sung that Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000. There's your inflation for you. With Saul outraged because he was ignorant of the proper structure of Hebrew poetry.
Oh, okay. Well, in a way, there's a scholar. I think all kinds of silly things have been said by scholars over the years, who wrote a little book on, not a very good book, on biblical poetry, and he said exactly what you say now. He said, well, Paul just missed the signal that that's the way a line of biblical poetry is supposed to be structured. You move from thousands to tens of thousands, as I observed at the beginning of my talk. But I think that's silly, because the necessity of form doesn't exclude meaning. So here, in fact, the form is adapted to meaning. That is, the young women of Israel who are chanting this line are saying, following the logic of line structure, but they're saying something that they mean. What they're saying is, okay, Saul's pretty great, he's won battles for us, but he's not as great as David. And that reasonably drives Saul to distraction.
I see the parallelism between chapter 3 and 39, but I feel like I'm missing God's voice in the question of pain. Is it actually, do we actually see where pain is addressed there, since Job was in pain, or is that absent, and if so, why?
Well, that's a tough one, I have to admit. That is, I think many readers, believers and non-believers, have not been entirely happy with the ending of Job. And we've seen so vividly and concretely the pain that Job endured that one could reasonably say, okay, we see that the world is more dynamic and contradictory and grand than Job has imagined. But still, what about all this suffering he's undergone? And I would say that the Job poet, as great as he is as a poet, doesn't entirely answer that. Oh, we'll get you next.
I want to just mention, we're talking about nature. That the poet uses. And I think that is what is really of value to our time, to be alive at this moment in history. And that we need to grasp Job as a very powerful description of creation. Now, I'm not interested in authority so much as romance. I think the ones who end up believing through pain and suffering and the degradation of our nature in our world today and other problems that we face, that the romantic is the one who survives, the one who falls in love. And this poetry makes me fall in love with God. I see him as so much more than I can imagine, And poetry helps you do that. If you have lists of rules and authorities that tell you how everything is, you can only go so far. But a surrender to this kind of God is possible when I see this beauty in the writing.
Well, it's a very eloquent and I think moving response to the book of Job, and I thank you for it. I would just add this, that by and large, you can find a few minor exceptions, but by and large, biblical poets are not all that interested in nature. But that's not true of the Job poet. That is not only in the God speech at the end, but along the way, in exploring a particular image or comparison, he will evoke the rainy season, the sprouting of grass in the spring, and so forth, which other biblical poets don't do. So this was an amazingly capacious imagination, I would say, and I can see that that imagination has gotten through to you, which is very nice. Okay, we have someone in the first row here.
I had thought the same as the previous questioners had thought about Job and God's response. However, now looking at it poetically, even more deeper, and God's response, I see now that God is softening his response through the poetry. You need it to soften his response and to actually get to Job, to go deeper go deeper. Do you remember, why? I know in your suffering and sorrow, you can't see why. And I am asking you to go deeper. And through the poetry is the only way to go deeper into why his suffering is so important and why he needs to look deeper into the meaning of God and to remember what God has taught him from the very beginning.
Thank you for that. And what I'd add to your comment is simply the dimension of, I'll call it visuality. That is, when I don't have the whole text of Job in front of me, but when Job speaks after he listens to the speech from the whirlwind, he says, I don't remember it word for word, so this is a loose paraphrase. He says, I had heard word of you, but now I have seen. And the seeing is something that poetry has brought him to do.
I appreciate everything you said. I mean, it's very good, and it definitely makes you look at it a whole different way, to where it really comes alive through poetry, and the word of God itself, in this sense, really comes alive because you can really see it. The question that I have is more curiosity, and that is kind of going back to an example in chapter 3. You have verses 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they're all comparing the light, the day, the light, the night, all of that. And then it throws in Leviathan. But yet at the same time, in the King James, it throws in mourning for Leviathan. Just an explanation for that one.
Well, the explanation simply is an error. Let me say this. I am an admirer of the King James Version. I'm much happier with the King James Version than with all the translations. You know, there was a flurry of them in the second half of the 20th century. And they were done by, let's say, ecclesiastical academic committees, by scholars with plenty of credentials. You know, they had advanced degrees in biblical studies in England from Oxford and Cambridge, and in this country from Yale and the Harvard Divinity School and so on and so forth. But they had a tin ear for English. Really, there's sometimes a mangling of English idioms, an offensive mingling of different levels of diction. So half of a verse sounds like a government directive, and the other half like the daily newspaper. Whereas the King James translators were in touch with literary English and had a great ear for literary English. For example, the leading figure among the translators was Lancelot Andrewes, who was the Bishop of London. And he was a great prose stylist. We know this because his sermons were published. So in many ways, the King James Version has real resonance and is an impressive literary achievement. But I would say this, that the knowledge of Hebrew among Christian Hebraists at the beginning of the 17th century was admirable but imperfect. So they scrambled certain things. They got the meanings of words wrong. They got confused by the syntax. Well, I'll give you another example. In the covenant between the cut animal parts in Genesis, between Abraham and God, the King James Version has a line that reads like this: "And lo, a great dread of darkness fell upon him." Now, this makes Abraham, our forefather, afraid of the dark. But in fact, what the Hebrew says, a great dark dread. And the thing is this, the word that means dark, afela, can either be an adjective meaning dark, or it can be a noun meaning darkness. And they messed up, they got confused about the syntax and read it as darkness, and therefore came out with this wrong meaning. So the same is true with Leviathan. That is, Levaya in the sense of funeral or mourning it's not really a biblical word. It's a rabbinic Hebrew word. And they didn't distinguish clearly between the two. And then they kind of let their perception of the grammar lapse a little bit. And they didn't realize that what they construed as a feminine, possessive suffix couldn't be that, because there's no feminine referent in the verse. So it's just limits of their knowledge of Hebrew.
Hello. Hi. I have a quick question about, I'll stand up. I have a quick question about form. I guess the way that I read Job is kind of like a spotlight. There's a spotlight on Job in his death wish. It's all about me, like, woe is me. And then the spotlight kind of shifts in 38 to God, where God's asking questions, and he's saying, it's actually me, like, where were you? Oh, you weren't there because it was me. But then in 39, it feels like the tone shifts, where it's not, I feel like the questions get farther and farther apart. It's not so much God saying, who are you? Who am I? It changes even in pronouns to more like they, he, she, and I'm curious, is it just like you said so that the poet can show off, like look at how many things I can do? Is it meant to ground us back in the majesties of nature? Is it meant to, I guess, like if Job is hearing this, if Job's hearing this response, what are we supposed to think of? Because it feels a little ranty in like an opposite direction. So.
Okay, well, I think that this poet felt, and this goes back to an earlier question / comment about nature and the love of nature, that this poet felt very deeply that nature was an awesome realm. I mean, maybe awesome in the modern colloquial sense. And so once he had given the big picture of light and darkness, creation, winds sweeping over the world and so forth, he then zooms in to the animal kingdom, and he evokes all these creatures. Now, the war horse, okay, probably he had a sense, this is a great opportunity to show what I can do. But it does also fit in with his representation of all these other powerful creatures in the natural world who manifest their strength and vitality. Did we have a gentleman in the front row? Okay, next.
Okay, I have a short anecdote here. I'm here in the
Oh,
middle.
good. I see.
I'm professor of Old Testament at Biola University. Before coming
I've spoken, as you know,
yes,
at
we
Biola.
sat at a table together last year.
Yeah.
Before that, I was in Canada and teaching Old Testament, and we had some guests on our campus who had lived and worked in China. The Chinese government decided that they must be spies, and so they arrested them and imprisoned them for over a year. And over the course of that year, they experienced repeated torture and attempts to extract information. And at one point early in their imprisonment, someone brought them their Bibles. And I'm not sure how that miracle happened, but all they had was their Bibles. So it was they were being tortured or they were reading their Bible for a whole year. And so I had taking this opportunity, I said, Julia, could you share with my students what was the part of the Bible that was most precious to you in this season of suffering? And I was flabbergasted when she responded, Job chapter 3.
Oh boy. Wow.
And I said, please help us understand why. And she said, I had never been in such the depths of despair as I was during that time. And I found this chapter in the Bible that perfectly expressed my own suffering and my own feeling about my life. And it just, she found a sense of solidarity with Job. And so I feel like this is a response partly to your comment earlier about where is suffering in this book. There's something, even though God doesn't respond explicitly to Job's suffering, his response preserves the conversation. And so somehow it makes space for us to express these hardships. and helps us to feel that we're a little bit less alone. So I thought I'd share that, and also wanted to say thank you. I've been using your translation of Job 3 in my classes every year when I teach Job, and we just read through this luscious poetry, and I think it opens up space for students to think, could I talk to God like that? Could I pray this honestly? What would it look like if I didn't just use canned prayers, but if I actually expressed how much despair or darkness I'm feeling? So I wanted to thank you for kind of opening that up for my students.
Well, thank you for that remark. It's an amazing anecdote that you tell. And what it reminded me of, by the way, in Hasidic tradition, there's this concept of chutzpah klape shmaya, which means, well, chutzpah, you all know chutzpah. So it's chutzpah toward the heavens, meaning God. And that is legitimated as an understandable human response when the human being is being authentic to his or her own experience of outrage and suffering. Yes?
So at the risk of going from the sublime to the potentially ridiculous, and prefacing this by saying I'm not a fan of numerology, because I'm sure numerologists can come up with just about any conclusion that he wants. But I'm curious whether in the selection of vocabulary used in Job or in other biblical literature, there's been any sensible numerological basis that you know about.
I don't think so. I know some fairly, I mean, obviously, numerology is, on the Bible has attracted a lot of cranks. It's also, I've read a couple of articles by fairly serious people, but who say, well, there's a pattern of sevens here, or there's a pattern of tens there, but it doesn't seem convincing to me.
I have a couple remarks about the possible dating, and I'm quite aware of Ezekiel, and that is, of course, from the earlier part of the 6th century, but at in a few places, you know, he says that the righteous of three ancient figures of wisdom, Noah, Daniel, and Job. Now, Daniel, of course, is not the prophet Daniel, who was barely out of his teens, but that is Job named here before the book of Job was written or after?
Oh, I think definitely before. That is, if you think about the folktale frame, obviously there was some kind of story. We don't necessarily think it's identical with the story we have in the canonical text about a wise and pious man named Job who went through some kind of period of suffering and then was rewarded for his virtue. And this poetic genius who composed the body of the book of Job took that story, broke it open, and made it the frame for his poetic book. Maybe he modified it to some extent, but it's not a perfect fit with the book of Job because, excuse me. Well, as many people have said, it doesn't seem plausible that God would agree to this wager with the adversary. And then the ending of the book of Job is a kind of fairy tale ending in which all his dead children are replaced, but we know that there's never replacement. And he has these 3 beautiful daughters who have names evocative of femininity and attractiveness. So there was an old story about Job. As I say, it may have circulated just orally, so we'll never know its exact formulation. And that was picked up by the poet as a frame for something entirely original. And Daniel also was some kind of legendary figure, and a writer in the 2nd century BCE decided to adopt Daniel and make him into the protagonist of that book.
Question back here.
Thank you, Professor, for your exposition this morning. Can you address the thing that always gets me with Job is the invitation to gird your loins and face me like a man before he goes on to talk about how vast and wonderful he is as God. Is that hyperbolic flourish from the poet, or is that a more intimate understanding of a Hebrew that they were made in the likeness and image of God and could therefore get in the octagon with God? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think what God is saying when he said, gird your loins, is that I'm about to deliver a series of truths to you. And they are going to be hard truths, not all of which will be easily assimilable. So now summon all your fortitude and listen to what I have to say.
Thank you very much. We have a break now, and then at noon in the church we have midday prayer, the hour of sext, in which we'll be using the early 60s Grail Psalter, which actually does try to reproduce some of the beauty of the Hebrew with the rhythm and accentuation. Okay. So there you are. So break now and sext at noon in the church. And lunch immediately following.